Hello, I would like to quickly bring your attention to the concept of cyclin-dependent kinases. Cyclin-dependent kinases. What are cyclin-dependent kinases? Cyclin-dependent kinases are enzymes that depend on cyclins. Cyclins are proteins. So these cyclins, when they have accumulated in sufficient amounts, they activate these cyclin dependent kinases. So the kinase is dependent on the cyclin. So when you have enough cyclin, the kinase will be activated. When the kinase is activated, it will now go and phosphorylate other enzymes that push the cell to moving from one phase to the next phase. So for example, there are kinases that are responsible for pushing the cell from the G1 phase into the S phase. So what happens is, once the cell has expressed the desire to divide, the amount of cyclin will start to increase until it reaches a threshold. That threshold will cause the cyclin dependent kinase. So we have a kinase that is dependent on the cyclin, on that accumulating cyclin. So the cyclin will accumulate, and after it accumulates, what happens is it will become activated. So now the cyclin dependent kinase is activated. When the cyclin dependent kinase is activated, it will now phosphorylate enzymes such as the RB protein or the RB enzyme that will push the cell into moving from one phase to the next phase. So you have different cyclin dependent kinases depending on which phase of the cell are we. But the concept is the same. Cyclin will accumulate, and when cyclin will accumulate, that particular cyclin dependent kinase will now be activated. And once the cyclin dependent kinase is activated, it's a kinase after all. So it will phosphorylate something. Kinases phosphorylate something. So when the cyclin dependent kinase is now activated, it will phosphorylate the necessary protein to push the cell from one phase to the other. So cells do not move from one phase in the cell cycle to the other phase simultaneously. It needs important proteins such as the RB protein. So the RB protein is a protein that needs to be phosphorylated. So the RB protein is a protein that pushes the cell from one phase to the next phase. And what happens is you have cyclin, and in between you have cyclin dependent kinases for each phase. So cyclin will begin to accumulate, and when it accumulates in sufficient amounts, it will activate cyclin dependent kinase, and then cyclin dependent kinase, it's dependent on cyclin after all. So the cyclin dependent kinase will now go and will phosphorylate the required protein such as RB protein, and the RB protein will push the cell from one phase to the next phase. That's very important for you to understand, that we have cyclin dependent kinases. Cyclin dependent kinases phosphorylate the necessary required proteins that push the dividing cell in the cell cycle from one phase to the next phase. Without the cyclin dependent kinases, the cell will not divide. In fact, in tumors, in cancer invasion, cancer metastasis, and uncontrollable cell division, you have these cyclin dependent kinases. Something that is wrong with them. They keep on phosphorylating these proteins that push the cell from one phase to the other, and that leads to uncontrollable cell division. The concept is we have cyclin dependent kinases. They are kinases. However, they will never be activated because they are only dependent on cyclin. So cyclin will keep on accumulating as the cell progresses through the phases of the cell cycle. When the cell reaches that end of each phase and needs to make the jump make the leap from one phase of the cell cycle to the next phase, that accumulated cyclin will reach a threshold that is sufficient to activate the cyclin dependent kinase. When the cyclin dependent kinase is activated, it will not do the job of carrying the cell to the next phase. What it will do is it will now go and phosphorylate that protein. Like I said, an example of that is the RB protein. It will phosphorylate that RB protein, and the RB protein will now carry the cell into the next phase of the cell cycle. And over there, the story will begin again. Cyclin will keep on accumulating, but now that cyclin dependent kinase in that next phase will not be the same cyclin dependent kinase in the previous phase. We have different cyclin dependent kinases. That's why tumor treatment targets cyclin dependent kinases on particular stages of the cell. So the cyclin dependent kinase that pushes the cell through the G1 phase, and the cyclin dependent kinase that pushes the cell through the S phase and pushes the cell through the G2 phase, they are different cyclin dependent kinases. But they do depend on cyclin, and then once they are phosphorylated, these cyclin dependent kinases, they will go and once they are activated due to the accumulation of that cyclin that reach a threshold, it will go and it will phosphorylate other proteins that push the cell into the next phase. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in our next video. Bye bye.